Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. In this video, I will be talking about Middlemarch by George Eliot, which is quite a long book. I feel like I have a lot to say, so this may be a long video. So I came to wanting to read Middlemarch because I was reading about it in comparison to Age of Innocence, where they're both writers looking back on a time of social change with the perspective and context of like 30 or 40 years of history. So they're not writing about exactly their moment in history, but kind of reflecting on like their parents' generation. And like in this conversation where there are kind of these large sweeps of change happening societally, we're seeing conflicts between, the old ways of the world and progress. And in this book, we're kind of seeing how the old ways hinder our characters and their personal lives from achieving their potential. So I was really excited to read this. I haven't read any George Eliot before, but George Eliot comes up in a lot of conversations about other writers and their influences. I mean, this book was really amazing, and I can totally see how she was so influential in the 19th century, certainly among the great novelists of that time period. She's in the same conversations as Dickens and Tolstoy and Austen. And I'm interested to read some other of her novels now, but it does seem to be the consensus that this is like her great work. So this novel is about this rural community, Middlemarch, and it consists of lots of different characters in this town, and the ways in which their stories overlap and sometimes don't overlap are very interesting. So I'm just going to try to introduce some of the main characters, the ones I'm going to be talking about the most in this video. There are a lot of different people in this book. So probably the most central character, the character we start with in this novel, is Dorothea Brooke, which is her name when we first meet her as an unmarried woman. And Dorothea, she's very unique among the other women of the community. She's very idealistic. She really feels things strongly and deeply and has really strong beliefs. And there's a kind of greatness in Dorothea. She's capable of something really big. She feels that, and she wants to use her life well, which doesn't necessarily fit with the kind of typical life that a woman of her birth and era can have. So in connection to Dorothea, we have her sister Celia, who isn't like contemplative in the way that Dorothea is, and kind of just wants the typical things that women are expected to want. And then we have their uncle and guardian, Mr. Brooke, who's kind of a useless, rich, landed gentry. He's kind of a ridiculous figure. And they're also connected to Sir James Chettam, who is another wealthy landowner. He's a younger man and a suitor of the Brooke sisters. But Dorothea is not interested in Sir James romantically, so he kind of moves his sights to Celia, because again, Dorothea, especially at the beginning of the novel, before she is married, she has this kind of vision that married life will allow her to do all the things she's meant to do and contribute something great to the world. And when she meets Mr. Casaubon, she thinks that she's found that. He's much older than her. He's like a scholar. He's got this big work that is, the summation of all of his life's work. It's like the only thing he's done. And Dorothea sees that and thinks, oh, I can help him complete this, and I am contributing to the good of humanity. Like, he is doing something important. I finally met someone who's making big change. So she marries him and things do not work out. But through Mr. Casaubon, we meet one of our other main characters, who is a relative of his, Will Ladislaw. And Will's, you know, kind of an unlucky character. His family tree got several bad shakes, unfair shakes, and his birth is a little bit in question. But the result is that he doesn't really have any money and is dependent on Mr. Casaubon for his education and, you know, funding his early life. And then when Will meets, you know, Mr. Casaubon's new wife, Dorothea, he, you know, kind of immediately falls in love with her and thinks there couldn't be a more perfect woman. Okay, so that's kind of like the Dorothea branch of this story. I think the other character that seems to be the most central is Dr. Lydgate, who is new in town. So he kind of has that air of mystery about him. People kind of know that he is connected to good people of like high birth. But Lydgate doesn't really care about that so much. He is like Dorothea in that he wants to do something big with his life, and he has this genuine passion in the career he's chosen of being a doctor. So his whole thing is that he wants to do good in the daily lives of people by being their doctor, but he also wants to do something great for the field at large in like the realm of research. So when he comes to Middlemarch, he's really thinking about building his career here. And he's very capable of doing that. He's very intelligent. He's a progressive thinker. You know, this is an era where people's ideas about medicine are pretty backwards, and Lydgate is sort of ahead of his time, which creates some issues for him. But that's really his career, is what he's focused on when he arrives. And then he meets the Vincey family, including their daughter, Rosamond Vincey. So Rosamond is the daughter of a wealthy manufacturer, which, you know, so she has all the look of status. You know, she dresses right and looks right and is, you know, a beautiful ornament. She has like the right kind of education, but she doesn't really have that like good blood. And that's kind of what Rosamond is obsessed with and what kind of makes her interested in Lydgate to begin with, and is the start of their romance. Connected to Rosamond Vincey, and what I kind of consider like a B plot of this book, is her brother Fred Vincey, who is like, he's such an irritating character to me because he's like this kind of arrogant kid who has like high expectations for things working out for him without him doing much, and things do work out for him without him doing much, so he's like a little annoying. But you know, he's in a position where he's not going to be inheriting anything from his father. He's hoping to inherit from this other wealthy relative who dies in the course of this book. He has this expectation that he's going to get something from that. And Fred is in love with a girl from his childhood, Mary Garth. And Mary Garth is of a class where she has to work for her money, as does the rest of her family, the Garths. And they're like, you know, kind of exemplary values in this story. You know, they value their labor. Her father, Mr. Garth, really just likes his work. He's an agent, and kind of the joke is that the reason why they don't have enough money is because he just does his work without taking money. But yeah, the Garths' kind of way of living and the work they do and how much effort they have to put in to survive is kind of a direct critique on Fred's behavior early in the book. So Mr. Fairbrother is a much nicer figure in this book. He is a clergyman, but he kind of has some regrets in his life because he doesn't really feel like he chose the correct career. He's like making the best of it, but it's not really what he feels he is suited for. But really just in all of these young people and their romances and their connections, he's kind of like giving moral guidance and helping people along. He facilitates a lot of the character change that happens in this book. And then another important figure is Mr. Bulstrode. He is a banker in Middlemarch. He has kind of unknown origins, which we find out towards the end are not very honorable. But he's interesting because he's, you know, he's very religious. He professes to be religious, but he does actually have this deep religious feeling, but he's kind of self-deluded in it because he can't really recognize his own flaws and his own like action and fault in the bad things that have happened in his life, because he kind of uses his religion as an excuse for a lot of things. But he's very influential in Middlemarch, and he likes to have people owe him. He likes to have people in debt to him. Okay, that is a lot of characters. There's more than that. We get so many sort of little glimpses into these random people in town. You know, Eliot lingers on like the auctioneer and like the woman who runs like the local tavern. Like it's very rich in the people that are built out in this book. Really, it feels like Dorothea, Lydgate, and to a lesser extent Fred Vincy and their various partners are kind of the central line of this book thematically. Okay, so let's talk about some of the historical context. This book takes place in like the couple years immediately preceding the Great Reform Bill of 1832. So this bill expanded voting rights in England and allowed a lot more men of different social class backgrounds to be able to have a say in their representatives. And it also shows kind of some of the shifts of the Industrial Revolution, in that the bill kind of balanced out the uneven representation of these country landlords and these urbanization that had begun to pop up. So these urban areas were getting more representation as a result of this bill. And keeping in mind that Eliot, she knows what the effects of this bill are because she's writing about this like 40 years later. So she's looking back on this time period with that context. And when this was originally published, the subtitle was A Study of Provincial Life. So there's certainly some commentary there on urban versus country. And there's a kind of tension there with this urban growth. We don't spend a lot of time outside of Middlemarch, but we hear characters talk about London in sort of a distrustful, unsavory way. Like that's where Bulstrode's like uncertain business origins, you know, they all happen in London. We see kind of like the laborers of Middlemarch being really distrustful of the railroads coming in because they sort of perceive it as a thing from London. So, you know, there's this kind of bubbling progress happening and an awareness of the characters that things are changing. The Reform Bill kind of marks a start to these strict social class lines being blurred. Like the members of like the landed gentry, like the kind of highest level of social class in this novel, they're very aware of the sense of instability in it. And a lot of them are like thinking maybe for the first time about their responsibility to the people who live and work on their property. You know, this is kind of at the top of Dorothea's mind because she wants to take on these great projects and do something good for people. Sir James, you know, he gets kind of taken in by Dorothea's ideas about that and wants to make his own improvements. There's this whole part about Mr. Brooke trying to run for office, and he's like running as a progressive candidate and gets kind of called out for not being a very good landlord, even though he's like professing to like want to be on these people's side politically. So he has to kind of examine his actions and take on a little more work to support those people. You know, there's definitely this sense of a change coming. But despite that progress, class distinction really defines the lives of these characters still. And it's not like the big obvious jumps of class distinction, but kind of the subtleties. You know, there's all these different shades of what it is to be a respectable person in society. So these are all people who are considered respectable and you can have associations with, but you know, there are limits there. So we have like people who are actually sort of working for a living, who need to work for a living, like the Garth family, like Will, you know, over the course of this book, he kind of rejects Mr. Casaubon's help and he's trying to make his own way. And he gets a job working for Mr. Brooke and his campaign and running this like progressive political newspaper for him, which is not like a great career to have if you want to be like a gentleman. But you know, he's trying to make his way in the world because he has to find a way to make his way in the world. Then there's this kind of new money vibe of these people in town who have made their fortune off of manufacturing, like the Vinci family. You know, they have the money, but they don't have the blood, which is like kind of the origin of Rosamond's obsession with that. And you know, both Rosamond and Fred have these kind of ideas of moving up in the world, Rosamond wanting to do so by marriage and Fred by inheritance from his... How are they related? Is he an uncle? And then we have like the highest tier, the landed leisure class, which is, you know, the Brookes and the Chetams. And those distinctions like really draw lines of who the characters are interacting with. Dorothea and Rosamond are primary female characters in this novel. And they have some conversations right towards the end, but they really hardly ever interact before that because it's kind of improper for Dorothea, especially when she's unmarried, to interact with Rosamond because of their social class difference. Even though Rosamond, you know, has all the trappings and manners of like the finest lady in the country. And then because of Dorothea's birth and position, that adds sort of extra objections to Will being a part of her life with his low birth in like the latter half of the novel. It was interesting, like all of these young people are kind of a similar class and have a certain commonality in that they kind of feel that they've been raised and educated for nothing. You know, they've been raised and educated not to do something, but just to live a certain lifestyle, with the exception of Lydgate, who really sought out his career as a doctor. So they're all kind of growing up with these old world notions of being a part of that leisure class or aspiring to be a part of that leisure class. And then when they're, you know, living the realities of life, when we see them sort of move into adulthood in their own homes and marriage, they're really ill prepared for it. Like Will, for instance, he has a lot of natural talent, but until he meets Dorothea, he's kind of wasting a lot of his time sort of wandering around and thinking, maybe I'll be a painter, maybe I'll be a poet, and not really settling on anything until he meets Dorothea and sort of resolves that he needs to settle on something for her. And it's kind of him going into politics, where in this new world order he could make a name for himself. Fred Vinci, like explicitly avoids doing or learning anything or having any kind of skill because he's like thinking, well, maybe I won't actually have to do anything because I'm going to inherit a estate and a title and all of that, and then I'll just be set for life, which does not end up happening. He does not get that inheritance. So then he's just kind of left with like, okay, what do I do with the rest of my life? Because he was like counting on that. And then it's much, much harder than that for the women. You know, there's a lot of musing in this book on comparing the kind of education that these girls get in comparison to their male counterparts, and how limiting and debilitating that is on what they can do as adults. You know, they don't get this like free will to decide how they're educated or what realms they can learn and how deep they can go. Dorothea especially is kind of like agonizing over how limiting her education has been. After she marries Mr. Casaubon, she's like trying to learn all these other languages so that she can help and contribute to his work, things that are not typically a part of the feminine education. There's this part where her guardian, Mr. Brooke, says, "There's a lightness about the feminine mind, a touch and go. Music, the fine arts, that kind of thing. They should study those up to a certain point, women should, but in a light way, you know." And that's kind of the thing that has limited Dorothea, is that she was only educated in a light way, and she wants the depth. She wants to really study the world, which makes a lot of sense when you think about George Eliot being the person writing this book, because she was very well informed and very educated. Far, far beyond what was typically proper for a woman to know at that point in time. And Rosamond is really educated to be like an ornament of society and nothing else. She has all of those like fine skills and manners, and that's what she has been trained for. She's basically been trained to marry someone rich. But then she marries Lydgate, who's kind of at the beginning of his career. He hasn't really made his mark yet. But Rosamond is really thinking more about his birth than the reality of his money. And then she's ill-prepared to be in a household where she has to budget. And she's just generally like unaware of what it means to be a doctor's wife, or just to be married to someone who dedicates time and energy to their career and cares about that. And so they both are kind of ineffective. Rosamond doesn't really seem to think about that much, but Dorothea is certainly thinking about it and sort of cursing her limits, especially because Dorothea knows what it is to have the potential to influence and still be ineffectual, because her guardian is Mr. Brooke, who kind of just like plays at politics and sort of plays at all of these different roles without actually doing anything. So anyone in this book who is a self-aware enough character to agonize over anything is agonizing over what the sum of their life is, what they can do, what kind of mark they can make on the world. Like, if they're going to spend their life and their time and their labor on something, is it going to make a difference? And we really see this kind of thinking and motivation in Dorothea and Lydgate the most. So at the start, Lydgate's in a really good position. He has all the education he needs. He has the right kind of mind. He has the tenacity and the desire and the vision to really do something big, to do some good work for the world, something that will leave his mark. You know, he comes into Middlemarch with a clear path for his life. But then there's Rosamond. Now, Dorothea, she thinks she knows her path too, but she's a woman, so she's limited. She has these like big ideas about things she would like to do, but really her path to greatness is to be the wife and helpmate of a great man. So that's like what she's looking for, is a great man. And that's how she feels she can contribute. And those kinds of ideas and feelings are what rush Dorothea into a marriage with Mr. Casaubon, who from the outside appears to be a great man doing great things. And she naively believes that there's some genius there and that it's a genius worth dedicating her entire life to. She's very devoted, like she's ready to give her absolute all to him. And really what we see as the point made here is that Dorothea's ignorance and the limits of her education lead to her getting trapped in this marriage, and that seems to be the case for all of these young women in this book. They're almost conned by society into marrying these men because they have this vision that it's going to make everything better, and it just never does. Her education is so limited, her world is so sheltered that she's naive and marries the first man that she thinks might be doing something big. It was this which made Dorothea so childlike, and according to some judges, so stupid with all her reputed cleverness, as for example in the present case of throwing herself, metaphorically speaking, at Mr. Casaubon's feet and kissing his unfashionable shoe ties as if he were a Protestant pope. She was not in the least teaching Mr. Casaubon to ask if he were good enough for her, but merely asking herself anxiously how she could be good enough for Mr. Casaubon. So Dorothea's been trained her whole life to be good enough for her husband and never thinks if he has the greatness to match her. Because again, Dorothea has this unique, wonderful greatness inside of her. And in the end, he's found to be short of what Dorothea actually needs, but it's too late. We really see in this book lots of different, fundamentally different characters having this shock upon the reality of marriage. They all kind of rush into these partnerships and then they're stuck there and it doesn't live up to what they thought it would be. And they're kind of kept ignorant of what marriage is. So, you know, it's not really their fault. You can hardly blame them for it. So there's this idea of, you know, having this imagined future for yourself, seeing your path of what your life is going to be, and that crumbling before you when you're faced with the reality of things. There's this part from Dorothea's mind: having once embarked on your marital voyage, it is impossible not to be aware that you make no way and that the sea is not within sight, that in fact you're exploring an enclosed basin. So she goes into this marriage thinking it's going to be this great big thing that's going to open so many doors, and she finds the world more closed off to her than ever. You know, similar things happen with Rosamond, although she's not thinking about it with as much depth, but she has this image of what her life will be as a married woman, this independence and freedom, and the realities of being married to Lydgate certainly do not live up to that. She becomes very bitter and resentful of him. And, you know, Lydgate also loses some of his imagined view of what marriage would be because it makes him have to think about all these worldly domestic concerns instead of focusing on his work. And Mr. Casaubon, he also kind of has an interesting transformation upon being married. You know, even this man who's supposedly so great and educated and so much older than Dorothea is also shocked by the state of marriage because he finds it to be an exposing kind of intimacy. Like, you have this person who's there who really sees you. And if you have insecurities about yourself, that's really going to bring those out if you think someone's watching you and judging you. And he perceives that all the time with Dorothea, even when they're in the era of their relationship where she's worshiping him. But, his insecurities are somewhat validated. Dorothea loses this vision of being able to worship her husband because she begins to doubt his work. Rosamond loses this view of ease in her life that she thought she would have. Lydgate loses the idea of having a helpmate to support him in his work, because Rosamond's certainly not going to do that. She doesn't care about his work very much. So we see these characters with these great big ideas for their future kind of get trapped and ensnared by domestic concerns. And those daily struggles, the little things that take up your mind and attention, distract you from your larger goals. We have these characters, Dorothea and Lydgate, who think they see their path so clearly and they just get completely knocked off of it. Dorothea feels very limited by the expectations of her being a married woman and the expectations of her social class. It feels very limiting to the usefulness she could have in her life. There's this phrase, sense of busy ineffectiveness. That's kind of what Dorothea feels, and all the things she has to do as a married woman. When would the days begin of that active wifely devotion, which was to strengthen her husband's life and exalt her own? So the activity that she craves, she wants to do something. It doesn't really happen with her marriage with Mr. Casaubon. She never gets to that point. And then Lydgate is kind of crushed by worldly annoyances. That's the phrase used. He was very miserable. Only those who know the supremacy of the intellectual life, the life which has a seed of ennobling thought and purpose within it, can understand the grief of one who falls from that serene activity into the absorbing, soul-wasting struggle with worldly annoyances. So kind of his grand plans get taken from him by the financial struggles of married life. And his struggles just with the townspeople. There's a lot of kind of unfounded gossip and ill will towards Lydgate because he is this progressive mind and he does things so differently than people expect that they mistrust him. He's like this London trained guy who's trying to change things that aren't broken in their mind, even though he's right about so many things, which is, hard for his pride. But that certainly affects his practice and the success that he has in Middlemarch. That he's kind of unapologetically different and forward-thinking, and people kind of tear him down because of that. He has the best of intentions about money things when he comes to Middlemarch. He's not going to get married for a long time because he's going to build up his practice and make his money and do all of these other things first, which is not how things work out. He ends up in a lot of debt after he marries Rosamond, and it's kind of all consuming on his mind, and everything he's doing is just to make more money, which, isn't kind of the noble purpose he started with, and it really hurts him and makes him kind of miserable to not be working towards those goals anymore, to just be thinking about getting through the next day, which is ultimately Lydgate's unraveling, what leads to his life being unsatisfying to him. But you can't blame him so much for the steps that get there, because he does genuinely fall in love with Rosamond. Like society has set this trap for them to end up together. There's this really beautiful part of this book. The language Eliot uses is so stunning in so many places, but it's kind of about them falling in love. Young lovemaking, that gossamer web, even the points it clings to, the things whence its subtle interlacings are swung, are scarcely perceptible. Momentary touches of fingertips, meetings of rays from blue and dark orbs, unfinished phrases, lightest changes of cheek and lip, faintest tremors. So, he rushes into a marriage he's not financially ready for because he loves Rosamond and Rosamond wants to be married. So, Lydgate is this essentially noble person who, because of his debt, is like forced to fall and go against all of these principles that he expresses earlier in the book. And it just makes him feel awful, like he's losing himself in it. Early in the book, he really has like a lot of concerns about Mr. Fairbrother, who has his own financial struggles. And his concern is that he's gambling with the express need to get money. He's like really trying to get money from that, which is not a gentlemanly thing to do. And kind of this rock bottom moment for Lydgate is when he does the same thing and he goes and gambles in this intense and desperate way because he's trying to get out from under his debt. Under this financial pressure, the person that Lydgate is essentially swallowed up and lost. Early when he comes to town in the book, that phrase, that word is used, swallowed, that like Middlemarch is gonna assimilate him and swallow him up. His uniqueness and his vision that a lot of people don't have, he loses by being part of this society. He does get out of this debt, but his marriage to Rosamond and all of that, he never realizes those great things that he wants. He sees his own life as essentially a failure because he was living and using his career to make money to satisfy Rosamond. And he successfully does make money eventually, as kind of the end of the book tells us, but he never achieves those great things. He never does the great good for the world that he always thought he would, and that he was capable of doing when he was a young man. So much of this book is really examining the internal lives of these characters and what they're thinking and what they sort of make of the sum of their lives, and, how their perspective affects the reality of things. How they feel their happiness, if they feel that they are happy. It's very inside their heads, which, kind of makes Middlemarch feel classed in like Tolstoy's novels in some way, in that internal agony and like cycling and thinking about these things that these characters do. There are a lot of overthinkers in this book for sure. So we see characters who genuinely believe their own lives and the narrative that they've told themselves. We see characters who genuinely face themselves in their lives and, suffer as a result. And we have a fair amount of characters who lead largely unexamined lives and don't have those internal struggles. Like Celia, for example. Celia is one of the first characters we meet in this book, and I kept kind of waiting for more to be made of her, but the reality is that Celia's kind of simple. She wanted to marry well and marry someone that was handsome and all of that, and she did that, and then she was happy, and she didn't really think about, what does it all mean in the way that her sister Dorothea does. She loves Dorothea, but she really doesn't understand her at all because of how differently they think about the world. Lydgate is miserable because he can't help but see himself. He can't ignore the realities of his life, how much he has changed from, moving to Middlemarch to, the time after he marries Rosamond. All he can see is himself and his own failure and what all of this means for the greater context of his life. And Mr. Casaubon becomes miserable because someone else is seeing him, which makes him hyper-focused on like his failure. And then an interesting character to get an internal view on is Mr. Bulstrode, who he really believes his own line, you know? He really thinks that if he did things that appear selfishly motivated, really it was more about, you know, he's the one who should have the money and the power because he's going to do good things in the name of God. So if he stole and cheated and did despicable things to other people, it's okay because everything he took is better used in his hands. And he just never seems to really feel his guilt fully. He's always kind of making excuses, and I think that's just how he survives. You know, towards the end, he kind of indirectly is responsible for a man's death because that man had information about Bulstrode's shady past and the bad things that he had done. And Bulstrode just, he can't even acknowledge to himself what role he played in that or what his motivations really were. So something that is really interesting to me in this book is this sort of unfulfilled, perfect matching between Dorothea and Lydgate. You know, in this video so far, I've talked about them a lot in the same vein because they do have these similarities. And you can't help but think while reading this book, wow, if these two had ended up together, like their lives would be perfect. They would find exactly what they were looking for in each other. You know, they both are loving other people before they even meet each other. What's interesting about this is that Eliot was writing two separate stories initially when she was writing about these characters. I think it was really like a stroke of genius to put them both in Middlemarch in the same place, in the same town, because they're living these kind of parallel experiences. And comparing their partners in marriage with each other, I think is really enlightening to, I don't know, this kind of missed opportunity that, you know, they will never have fulfilled of what could have been with each other, or at least the possibility that the reader sees, because I don't think either of these characters see each other well enough to know that, at least not till the end of the novel. But at the end of the novel, they just sort of admire each other and see the good qualities, but it's not like they're ever like romantically interested in each other. So for instance, Dorothea is really disappointed in the fruitlessness of Mr. Casaubon's work. You know, his great work is essentially nothing. You know, it's work that's already been done. It doesn't need to exist. It's not going to contribute anything new. You know, he's not in a position where he's actually going to help anyone. His life's work has basically been wasted. And if his life is wasted, that means his wife's life is also wasted because she exists to help him bring this work forward in Dorothea's mind. I mean, comparing Mr. Casaubon's career potential to Dr. Lydgate, you know, Lydgate is in a much better position to actually do good in the world. He could actually make a big influence, a big change. He's progressive and ahead of the game, you know, he's not doing something that's already been done. You know, Lydgate's big disappointment in marriage is that he wants someone who will help him in his work, who will be interested in his work, and who will be the helpmate that Dorothea wants to be so desperately. And Rosamond hates his profession. She doesn't like it at all. She just wants to do the parties and be in society and have the finer things. She doesn't care about his work, and she's not interested in helping him with any of it. You know, Lydgate, you know, after he meets Dorothea and interacts with her, he can't help but directly compare her to Rosamond in that Dorothea has this wifely devotion to the aims of her husband. Like, that's what Lydgate wanted in marriage. That's what he thought he was going to get in marriage. Like, Dorothea deeply believes in devoting herself completely to her husband, and in that way contributing to the progress of the world. Like, she is tailor-made for someone like Lydgate, but their paths just never cross in that way. You know, it's not sort of the end of all happiness. Dorothea does end in a happy place, married to Will. You know, she marries him for genuine love, like Lydgate married Rosamond. But those marriages are the end of greatness for both. And maybe that greatness could have been achieved if these two like-minded people had ended up together. And that's kind of what it all boils down to, is this unfulfilled potential for greatness. There are these people that could make their mark on history, and their lives and their worlds don't allow them to. That there's lots of people in the world who could have done great things that weren't allowed to. Names we're not going to remember. There's this part before Dorothea and Will are married where he gets this glimpse of this greatness in her, this ability in her that she could really change things, and it makes him uncomfortable because that's not the order of things. That's not what you expect to see from a woman. You know, men are the world changers. And that just doesn't bode well for that side of herself getting proper expression in their marriage. And, you know, the last pages of this book kind of tell us that she doesn't really get to fulfill that. You know, all through the book, her ideas for change and progress to better people's lives are kind of trivialized as, you know, those are, oh, Dorothea's schemes, her plans, like they're some silly thing, like she's just entertaining herself with them or something. But she's so limited by her education and by the role of being a wife that she never really gets to see any of that through to the end. You know, the people who have seen the greatness in her, some of them are expressing disappointment that nothing ever really came of it, but even they can't think of what else she could do because she's a woman. She had no other option but to be a wife, and that's kind of all she is. That's the sum of her life, is being a wife to Will, being the wife of a politician. And being a wife means being delegated to small tasks only. You know, she can't change anything in big strokes. Which, you know, doesn't mean she's completely unhappy. You know, there's this point made in like the final lines of this book about her doing a lot of goodness in the world, adding a lot of good. But good is not great. Good is not history making. Good is not grand. Good is not these big things that were inside of her, which is a very, very sad ending. I think especially for readers who maybe aspire to something more and looking to their future for something bigger, this character who could have done something but doesn't. It's a very sad way for it to end. Yeah, this was an amazing novel. It feels so ahead of its time. It feels so fresh, even reading it so many years later. It's very understandable how influential Eliot was, and it's kind of a shame. I think her influence was downplayed by literary history throughout much of the 20th century and, you know, modern perspective, which is the case for a lot of female writers of the time, are, you know, coming around to acknowledging them. You know, there's lots of credit due there. She absolutely weighs up against all the other great writers of that time. This is an amazing novel. And it's interesting, you know, she was so studied and well-informed and, you know, had thought about all of these philosophical and social concerns and really understood on a very deep level the political movings of her world in a way that women were not often allowed to, and that deep knowledge is all over this book. You know, Middlemarch and these characters in their lives, it's just a perfect vessel to reflect on all of those things and how they affect the individual. Okay, so that was definitely a long one, but that is all I have for this video. Thanks for watching. Bye.